with us this morning, political commentators, both, and Peter's a political strategist as well. Tell us, Theo, how important Keir Starmer is at the moment in all these discussions in regard to Ukraine, do you think?
Ukrainian sovereignty and economic pressure on Russia, but also what Sir Keir called a coalition of the willing, countries that would work with Ukraine on a peace deal and potentially be part of some sort of peacekeeping force.
Really adamant that they would be prepared to put peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine should it be deemed necessary, but of course they want that backstop, that security backstop from the United States. But in the wider picture of where we find ourselves right now, the Prime Minister's statement says it all.
Now, here are some of the European NATO leaders at the weekend. It's all happy families, but how many of this group are actually willing? Well, the makeup of the coalition is something that Keir Starmer is keeping fairly quiet about because it's an evolving initiative.
Did Keir Starmer just cross a constitutional red line that no British Prime Minister has dared to cross before? The UK's most senior judge certainly thinks so, unleashing an unprecedented public condemnation that has shocked legal experts across the nation. Why would a former director of public prosecutions attack a judge for simply upholding human rights protections? The clash over a Ukrainian family scheme ruling has exposed what many fear is a dangerous new approach to justice, one where political convenience trumps legal principles. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's extraordinary attack on Britain's judiciary has sparked what many legal experts are calling an unprecedented constitutional crisis. During a recent parliamentary session, Starmer didn't just disagree with a court ruling. He launched a full-scale assault on judicial independence.
He needs to decide to come to the table and negotiate with primarily Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. So
it definitely includes the United Kingdom and France because it's their idea. And it likely also includes Italy and Canada and maybe the Netherlands and perhaps the small Baltic states. But beyond that, it's pretty uncertain. Spain has ruled out participation.
Yes, Keir Starmer is trying to cement his position amongst European leaders, but the real negotiations, the ones that really matter, are between Donald Trump, his team in the US administration.
Germany cannot agree to such a commitment when it's in between chancellors. Poland has a pretty big army, but is clearly nervous that if it deploys a proportion of its forces to Ukraine, it'll be short of troops to declare any future Russian aggression attack.
That has left the UK's most senior judge deeply troubled and the legal community stunned. At the heart of this controversy lies a seemingly routine case. A Palestinian family from Gaza sought to join their relatives in the UK by applying under the Ukraine family scheme. When the case reached court, the judge ruled in their favor, citing established human rights protections that Parliament itself had previously enshrined in law. The judge wasn't creating new law or misapplying the Ukraine scheme. They were simply interpreting and enforcing the legal protections already on the books. Rather than accepting this judicial interpretation or proposing legislative changes through proper channels, Starmer took the extraordinary step of publicly declaring in Parliament that the decision was completely wrong and cannot be allowed to stand. His precise words, "Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, I do not agree with the decision. She's right, it's the wrong decision," represented a direct challenge to judicial authority from the highest office in the land. What makes Starmer's attack particularly troubling is how he attempted to shift responsibility away from his government. Rather than acknowledging that the Home Office could have provided alternative application pathways for vulnerable families, he suggested judges were responsible for an unpopular immigration outcome. This deliberate framing wasn't just political deflection. It represented a dangerous blurring of the constitutional boundaries that separate Britain's judiciary from its political branches. The reaction from Baroness Carr, the UK's most senior judge, demonstrates just how seriously the legal establishment views this breach of constitutional norms. Not only did she take the extraordinary step of writing directly to the Prime Minister, but she also used her annual press conference to issue a stark public warning.
Starmer is positioning himself amongst European leaders, but in reality, what is he actually achieving? This coalition of the willing, it doesn't seem to be having a lot of willing people. You know, a lot of people, a lot of these nations...
Well, quite a few members of it.
There's a few members, but what are they actually going to contribute?
Elsewhere in the north. So the UK will be a key participant. But of its available forces, there would likely be only about, say, 5,000 on the ground at any one time. And there needs to be 3 times as many troops to be available for whatever number is deployed.
Be contributing for you. We don't know about peacekeeping troops or not.
We're all still very vague on the details when everyone seems to be making the right noises, but with only France and ourselves willing to put boots on the ground, openly stating that. I mean, it's somewhat of a kick in the teeth for Starmer in terms of his actual ability to deliver on something.
Depending on the involvement, the RAF could play a part. Britain's Typhoons and F-35 fighter jets will be a real asset. But there are only a handful of squadrons of each of those, and they'd be working very, very hard.
About the implications of his rhetoric. This level of public rebuke from Britain's top judge to a sitting prime minister has virtually no modern precedent in British political history. Particularly alarming was Baroness Carr's revelation that judges now face unprecedented threats to their safety, a situation she linked directly to the kind of political rhetoric employed by Starmer. Her warning went beyond defending a single court decision. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the fundamental principle that judges must be able to rule impartially without fear of political retribution or public backlash incited by government officials. What makes this situation especially ironic is Starmer's own background. As a former human rights lawyer and director of public prosecutions, Starmer built his entire career on defending legal principles and judicial independence. He once advocated passionately for the very human rights protections he now criticizes courts for upholding. This stark transformation from defender of judicial independence to its critic suggests a deeply calculated political move rather than a principled stance. Historically, British prime ministers have been careful to respect judicial independence even when disagreeing with specific rulings. The separation of powers, with Parliament making laws, the executive implementing them, and courts interpreting them, forms the bedrock of British democracy. Even during controversial cases like Brexit-related rulings, previous prime ministers typically confined their criticisms to policy implications rather than directly attacking judicial reasoning or individual judges. So what motivated Starmer to risk such a fundamental constitutional confrontation? Political analysts point to immigration as an increasingly contentious issue.
But I will say he's played this pretty well from a kind of PR perspective, and I think he's looking like he's important, but let's be real, Donald Trump will just ignore him if necessary. He's somewhat of an irrelevancy to the grander scheme and the grander negotiations that are happening.
Now, France has more than 110,000 troops, but again, nowhere near that number would be deployed, and they still need 3 times as many as however many they have on the ground. France also has Rafale and Mirage jets.
I mean, one thing I do find very interesting is the rise of Saudi Arabia and how they have become the country to which these negotiations are happening. I think that's a really important aspect that a lot of people haven't really talked about. But
they're very good, but not enough squadrons to do a major, enduring enforcement operation. And the rest of NATO pales in comparison to US military capability. And without the US
in British politics. By publicly opposing a court ruling that allowed a Palestinian family to stay in the UK, Starmer may be attempting to position himself as tough on immigration to neutralize criticism from the political right. But the price of this political maneuver, undermining judicial independence, could have far-reaching consequences beyond this single case. Baroness Carr's remarkable public press conference represents a watershed moment in judicial executive relations. Her statement that judges approach every case with absolute impartiality and her emphasis on fostering the independence of the judiciary drew a clear constitutional line that no prime minister should cross. The fact that she felt compelled to make such a statement publicly rather than through traditional channels shows just how seriously the judiciary views this threat to its independence. This clash marks a dangerous turning point in British politics. Starmer's willingness to publicly criticize the judiciary signals a troubling shift where constitutional norms are sacrificed for political expediency. The irony cannot be overlooked. A former director of public prosecutions who built his career on human rights law now undermines the very institutions he once championed. Starmer's transformation from defender to critic of judicial independence raises profound questions about political principles versus political convenience. Parliament must now defend our constitutional framework or risk normalizing attacks on judges as acceptable political strategy. When leaders prioritize polling over principles, the foundational separation of powers that protects our democracy stands in genuine peril.